us for more, though, on what we can expect from phase one of the U.S. China trade deal. I want to bring in Robert Holleyman. He is the former deputy U.S. trade representative. Good morning to you, Ambassador.
Good morning.
Are you celebrating the same way folks in the White House were?
Yeah, I'm celebrating the fact that we're getting a reset in making arrangement with China. What I'm not celebrating is the fact that the toughest issues that were at the heart of the 301 action, by all accounts, still have not been addressed. I think it's probably the clearest in the fact that the U.S. is going to keep tariffs of up to 25% on $370 billion of annual imports from China. That's 2/3 of all of what the U.S. imports from China. And I think that tells you on its face that the U.S. believes they've made some progress, but the vast majority of what's needed to resettle and resolve our relationships with China are not yet part of a deal.
And how do you handicap our ability to hold China accountable for the $200 billion in terms of purchases that should or are supposed to be made over the next 2 years?
Well, there are really two things. One, they're the elements of the deal that are a trade agreement, and those are the elements where the tariffs can be reimposed, or certainly the president could further increase the existing tariffs that are there. The second part, which is this purchase agreement, is really not a trade deal. That's really a buy and sell arrangement. That's sort of not what trade deals are about. That's really not something we should think of as a trade negotiation, of which tariffs are part. It's a sales deal. And there, I think the administration will use a variety of tools, but of course the metrics around that are going to be very hard to show, and they will be next to impossible to show metrics before the election. And of course that's part of this calculation, which is China's willing to make some promises, but the proof of whether they deliver is something that we're not likely to see until 2021 or 2022.
And so on the hard issues that you say have gone unresolved, what is the chance that they do get resolved prior to the election?
Well, we're sort of 2 years into a negotiation, and clearly the administration, any administration, would want to resolve those hardest issues first. And the fact that we've had 2 years and we get a phase one deal, and again, there is some progress, but the fact that the biggest, toughest issues that underscored and underpinned the 301 action are not part of this deal by all accounts really tells us that China is slow walking this, largely because China doesn't want to make the kind of reforms that the U.S. needs because they, China, believe it's in their interest to try to grow their economy at the expense of the U.S. economy. So I think it's highly unlikely that those issues will get resolved before the election. And indeed, it remains unlikely and very tough for either this president in the second term or a new president to resolve those issues. But we have to keep the persistence. We have to keep the pressure on. The question is whether these high tariffs that are being borne by U.S. businesses and consumers, nearly $5 billion of costs to the U.S. a month, are worth the price for the speculative nature of a phase two agreement in 2021 or beyond.
Ambassador, you bring up the key question. The Chinese are probably slow walking this. They want to see what happens in the election, too. So what do you think the outcome is if the president's reelected and we sit down again, or if a Democrat wins, rolls off the tariffs, and then picks up again? What happens in either scenario?
Well, look, I think primarily the Chinese are slow walking this, not so much because of the election. They're slow walking it because they don't want to do this, regardless of who is in the White House, largely because they think the imbalance that currently exists around tech transfers, theft of trade secrets, the type of industrial policy they have, which is really what underlies this, that's a risk to the U.S. economy. They don't want to make those changes.
Right.
So whether President Trump's there or another president's there, they're going to resist it.
I guess the idea of rolling off the tariffs completely, though, you really think that that would make them more likely to actually sign a deal at this point?
Look, I don't think we have evidence that the high tariffs that have been imposed have been the basis on which China has made the concessions that they've made today. In fact, If you look at the underlying action on this, which was the 301 report, that started with about 50-something billion in tariffs to deal with the fundamental problem. The fact that we're keeping tariffs on $370 billion a year imports for China, again, on its face, says that the bulk of this hasn't been resolved. I commend the negotiators for making progress. China agreed 10 years ago that they would stop the forced technology transfers. They are making some commitments on that 10 years later that should be enforceable. So there is progress, but it is the small portion of the pie. More needs to be done.
Ambassador, final question. What would you do with Huawei? The Wall Street Journal noting today that the pressure is still on them.
Huawei should be, one, treated completely separately from a trade agreement. We should not negotiate on issues that address U.S. national security. I don't have any intelligence information, but if the U.S. views Huawei as a national security threat, or the U.S. views Huawei as having violated U.S. laws, subject to potential criminal penalties or sanctions, the U.S. should pursue that vigorously, but it should not be part of a trade-off of national security for economic interest.